Hamburger patty found in an abdominal skin fold of a morbidly obese lady. People that do autopsies, what's the weirdest thing that you have found that didn't have anything to do with the person's death? Hey Uo, my favorite viewer is back for another story time. So good to see you, my dude. Did you miss your boy Andrew? You can't hide it, I know you did. Since you're here, can you do a bro is solid and hit the like button and maybe even subscribe? Just remember, you can always unsub if you don't like my stories, I promise I won't get mad. Anyway, let's start the stories. Elderly pensioner died alone in his home. Not suspicious at all. Small mobile phone, flip phone, found in his rectum. No explanation ever determined. I was volunteering at the coroner's office, and the doc pulled a very large, intact avocado pit out of a man's stomach. We all kind of looked at it and went, huh. Cause of death was a heart attack. One of my friends did this autopsy, and he said that he found 24 screws in the large intestine of a 75-year-old woman. The weirdest part is she died of a heart attack while in the shower. There was no possible explanation other than she was suffering from pica. While completing the post-autopsy repair for a gentleman, I found a plastic ladle tucked under the ribs. It was probably left by some poor autopsy technician who got yelled at for losing the good ladle. I offered to send it back to the coroner, but they never returned my calls. Other causes of death, impending ones. Malignancies that weren't diagnosed, hepatitis, occult bleeding, etc. Once found full-blown metastatic stomach cancer in a college kid that died in a bar fight that escalated. It was pretty remarkable. A professor was explaining to us the brain's ability to compensate and said there was a case, I believe the person had died of old age, of someone missing an entire hemisphere of the brain. In its place was one big tumor. There were no signs of symptoms of this throughout the patient's lifetime. Pennies. Hundreds of pennies, nearly $6 worth inside the skin all over the arms and legs. Deceased was a hermit, lived alone, ordered out for every meal. Apparently he'd been surgically implanting pennies in his skin for years. No funking clue why. 5 years ago an autopsy I viewed, the patient was put down to have died from post-surgical complications from a colostomy infection, lead to sepsis, and ended with MOF. When they began the examination and looked, they found some surgical tweezers left behind, which was attributed to being cause of the infection because of how tucked away they were. I am unaware of what happened afterwards, but it was definitely referred higher. Spoke with a pathologist at a conference. During her training at the medical examiner's office, they were doing an autopsy on a body that was found by a river. They did a CT and something looked funny about his gut. When they opened him up, his stomach moved. It was a snake that had burrowed inside his body. It struck and bit one of the techs before they realized what was going on. Okay, this isn't an autopsy, but I work in a pathology lab, and we get all the parts that are removed from a human during surgery. Tumors, moles, appendages, stones, kidney, bladder, gallbladder, etc. One day a large, long, cylindrical stone was removed from a man's penis. We have to break this stone down to its chemical components so we can tell what it's predominantly made from, calcium. So we put this stone in solution, and as it dissolved we realized something was in the center. It was a Bic pen cap. There's no way it came from above. Back in the 90s, I worked for the company that was contracted to move bodies for the coroner. We picked up the body of a lady who had worked as a tailor in her youth. When they did the post-mortem, there were several dressmaking pins and needles under her skin, mainly in her legs. There was also a pin lodged in her lung. Coroner thought she must have inhaled it. She'd suffered a pulmonary embolism back in the 60s which had forced her to retire. Maybe the pin was the cause of it. How she hadn't felt the pins or that none of them had been picked up on X-rays or scans she'd had in later life, I don't know. Cause of death was a stroke. Oh man. Okay, one time we had an autopsy on a guy who had died abroad whilst on holiday. He'd already had an autopsy in his country of death. He needed another autopsy in his home country before his death could be registered, so that was our job. He had been embalmed and repatriated to us. Obviously by the time we received his body, his brain had already been removed and dissected, and the skull sutured closed. My colleague reopened the skull as we weren't sure of autopsy procedures in the country of death. The skull cavity was stuffed with underpants. Edit. The weirdest bit, which I should have mentioned in my original post, was that the body arrived with a bag of the guy's belongings including his own underpants. Wow, I've got a lot of stories for this one. We once had a homeless dude who outed on opiates. This comes in a lot. During the external exam, we removed his pants and they were just full of bacon. Like, at least 40 packs of bacon. Turns out he had shoplifted a ton of it, then shot up in some run-down house and died with it all in his pants. It was pretty shocking. We also had a guy who took a bullet to the back of his head, execution style, and after the x-rays determined the bullet was not in his head anymore, we couldn't find the exit wound anywhere. Once we took out the brain, we discovered it exited perfectly out of one of his nostrils, leaving no trace of an external exit wound. One of the cadavers we learned from in med school had his sciatic nerve somehow passing through the middle of his piriformis muscle. It wasn't fused to the site of the muscle via scarring, it ran right through the middle of the muscle. His medical history was unknown, but we expected that sciatic nerve pain was probably on the list. I think of him when a patient doesn't respond to typical treatments for things. Sometimes people are built differently than everyone else, and you have to think outside the box to figure out what's going on. Edit. Apparently this isn't all that uncommon a phenomenon, which we might have learned at the time. But I definitely do remember looking down at the nerve passing through the middle of the muscle and thinking, what the funk? That was not something I thought was possible before seeing it for myself. Shout out to everyone who has gifted their bodies to science. My forensic medicine lectures took place in the department's Museum of Oddities. There are plenty of interesting items on display, but one particularly strange display caught my eye. It was an unlabeled cardboard box with 20-ish thin metal bars 10 centimeters, around 4 inches, long. One of the pathologists explained that the random pieces of metal were actually spoon handles which were found in a young woman's stomach. The remaining portion of the spoons was melted away by stomach acid. The woman was a patient in a psychiatric hospital in the 50s-60s and evidently had a tendency to swallow spoons, but her unusual diet had nothing to do with her cause of death. Can't exactly remember what it was. On a more humorous note, the museum also features a variety of strange tattoos. My favorite was a tattoo on the left upper thigh of a soldier which read, "Nur für Damen, i.e., ladies only." Benoit balls in the rectum of a male who died of huffing duster. Female with a tattoo that covered her back that said "Funk you funking funks." Elderly female with 5 very old tampon in her vaginal canal. Big, burly, leather-clad bikers with delicate lacy panties. Elderly male with a Prince Albert piercing. We had to remove all jewelry and that was awkward. Accessory spleens were super common, but one lady had 14 of them, but no actual spleen. Just 14 little blueberry-sized accessory spleens. Horseshoe kidney is always a cool find. Human anatomy has its within normal limits range, but within that range, there are some weird things. Oh surprise, Impima was gag-worthy. Edit. I no longer work this job, I miss it. You guys have made the last few hours at my current job more fun. I hope at least one of you has an accessory spleen. An 88-year-old grandma died of carbon monoxide poisoning. During the autopsy we couldn't open the back of the cranium. After much drilling we realized that her cranium was around 3 to 4 centimeters thick all the way around, leaving her with the smallest brain on a grown woman I've ever seen. She was fully functioning and never seemed affected by it in the slightest. I've never seen anything like it since. Sorry I haven't managed to reply to all questions. I never expected anyone to find my autopsy stories interesting. I knew she functioned well until her death because she ran a soft cheese-making business with her daughters. She died when the gas tank used to heat the milk leaked carbon monoxide into the room, and she passed out and died. One of her daughters also passed out, but her face was close to the space under the door, and fresh air came in, enough to prevent her from dying. I asked the family if she or they had known of her condition and no one had any idea. Physically there was nothing remarkable. No deformities at all visible externally, neither in body nor face. We included the information in the autopsy report, but since it wasn't related to the cause of death, it wasn't investigated further. Just for clarification, I'm female with a background in forensics and profiling. Hope this helps. Thanks for watching. What did you think of the story time? Let me know in the comments below. If you liked the video, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any more story times.